Cologne, Germany, March 6, 1945, a great medieval city reduced to a wilderness of rubble by years of bombing, and rising above the ruins almost untouched, the vast twin spires of its ancient cathedral. In the shadow of that cathedral, a German Panther tank sat waiting in ambush. It had just destroyed an American Sherman a few streets away, killing most of its crew. Now it covered the open square, its long gun hunting for the next target, and rolling slowly toward it through the broken streets came a single American tank, sent to kill it or die trying. What happened in the next few moments would become one of the most extraordinary pieces of film to come out of the entire Second World War, because an American combat cameraman had climbed into a ruined building overlooking the square, and he was about to capture something almost no one ever filmed: a duel between two tanks, fought to the death in real time. Inside the American tank, at the gunner's controls, sat a quiet 21-year-old from the coal country of Pennsylvania named Clarence Smoyer. In about a minute, his war and his conscience would change forever. This is the story of that duel in front of Cologne Cathedral and of the gunner who fought it. It is a story about a brand new tank built to take on the monsters that had been slaughtering American crews. It is a story about a single minute of combat that a camera preserved forever. And it is a story about the terrible weight a good man can carry home from war, and the remarkable way, half a century later, that he finally set it down. To understand how it all came together in that square, we have to go back to the long, bloody road that brought Clarence Smoyer to Cologne. For nearly a year, American tank crews had been fighting their way across Europe at a fearful cost. Their workhorse tank, the Sherman, was reliable and fast, but its gun and armor were no match for the heaviest German tanks. Crews had grim nicknames for what could happen when a German shell found them. Too many good men had burned. Clarence Smoyer had seen it happen to friends, and he had made himself into one of the deadliest gunners in his division, because in a tank, the crew that fired first and fired straight was usually the crew that lived. By March 1945, he had been fighting for a long time. Before we go on, if you love these true stories of courage from the Second World War, please take a moment to subscribe to the channel and to give this video a like, and stay with us all the way to the end, because the story of what this gunner did and the man he later forgave is one you will want to hear in full. To understand the duel at the cathedral, you first have to understand the division Clarence Smoyer fought in, the deadly problem that haunted every American tank crew, and the brand new machine that was finally sent across the ocean to do something about it. Smoyer served in the 3rd Armored Division, nicknamed the Spearhead, one of the hardest driving armored units in the United States Army. From the hedgerows of Normandy, through the desperate winter fighting in the Ardennes, and now into Germany itself, the Spearhead had been at the tip of the American advance. But the division had paid a brutal price. Again and again, its Sherman tanks had run up against German Panthers and Tigers, machines with thicker armor and harder-hitting guns, and again, American crews had been outmatched in a straight fight. Something had to change. Clarence Smoyer was not a man who sought glory. He was gentle and soft-spoken, raised in the Pennsylvania coal country, the kind of young man who would rather avoid a fight than start one. But the army had discovered that he had a rare gift. Behind the sights of a tank gun, he was deadly accurate and ice-cold under pressure, able to find the target and hit it in the few seconds that decided whether a crew lived or died. That gift had made him the gunner of his crew, and it had kept his tank alive through months of fighting that had killed so many others. Then, in the final winter of the war, the answer to the Sherman's problem finally arrived. It was a powerful new American tank called the M26 Pershing, with thick armor and a long 90mm gun that could at last meet a Panther or a Tiger on equal terms. Only a small handful had been rushed across the Atlantic for combat testing, and Smoyer's crew was chosen to take one into battle. They named their Pershing after a tank they had loved before, and they came to trust its heavy gun. For the first time, they rolled toward the enemy in a machine that could truly fight back. By early March 1945, the Spearhead Division was driving hard for the Rhine, and squarely in its path lay Cologne, the largest German city west of the river. Years of Allied air raids had hammered Cologne into a moonscape of shattered buildings and choking dust. Yet through it all, the great Gothic cathedral still stood, its twin towers looming over the wreckage like something from another age. The Germans meant to defend the city street by street before pulling back across the Rhine. For the men of the Spearhead, taking Cologne would mean a grinding, dangerous fight through the ruins. On March 6, 1945, the tanks of the Spearhead pushed into the heart of Cologne, infantry moving warily alongside them through the rubble. It was the kind of fighting tank crews hated most. In the narrow, debris-choked streets, a hidden gun or a lurking enemy tank could be waiting around any corner, and a tank that rounded that corner blind could be dead before its crew ever saw the threat. The great cathedral drew closer with every block, the prize at the center of the ruined city. And somewhere in the streets near that cathedral, a German Panther was waiting. The Panther was one of the finest tanks of the war, with a deadly high-velocity gun and a sloped front armor that could turn aside many shells. Its commander had placed it well, in a spot where it could cover the open ground near the cathedral and fire down the approaching streets. For an American tank coming up one of those streets, it was a death trap. The German crew sat silent and still, engine idling, gun trained on the junction, waiting for the first Allied tank to nose into the open. They did not have long to wait. 2 American Shermans came up the street toward the cathedral square, and the waiting Panther opened fire. The lead Sherman was hit and knocked out almost at once, and 3 of the 5 men aboard were killed. It was exactly the nightmare the crews had feared, the heavier German tank striking first from cover. The survivors scrambled clear, and word raced back through the American column that a Panther was blocking the way to the cathedral and had already drawn blood. The advance had stalled, and something would have to be done about that tank. There was another tragedy in those streets that day, one that the cameras also caught. In the confusion of the fighting, as tanks exchanged fire near the square, a civilian car drove into the open, directly into the line of fire. A young German woman named Katharina Esser was struck and mortally wounded. American soldiers and medics rushed to help her, but nothing could be done, and she died of her wounds. In the chaos of battle, no one could say for certain whose shot had hit her. It was a moment of war's blind cruelty, and it would haunt one of the men there for the rest of his life. Now the call went out for the crew with the new Pershing. Smoyer and his tank were ordered up to deal with the Panther that had stalled the advance. A bold plan took shape. An American combat cameraman, Sergeant Jim Bates, had crept forward with the troops, eager to film the fall of the cathedral. Together with Smoyer's tank commander, he climbed to an upper floor of a building overlooking the square to study the Panther's position. The plan was for the Pershing to dart into the intersection, strike the Panther in its flank, and pull back, with Bates filming the whole thing from above. Down in the turret of the Pershing, Clarence Smoyer settled behind his gun sight, his shoulder against the breech of the big 90mm gun. The plan was clear. They would roll forward just far enough to see the Panther's side, and he would put his shells into it before the Germans could react. The loader had an armor-piercing round ready. The commander gave the word, the driver let out the clutch, and the heavy tank lurched forward toward the open junction. Every man knew that the next few seconds would decide whether they lived or died. But as the Pershing rolled into the intersection, the plan came apart. The Panther was not where they expected its flank to be. Instead, its great gun was already swinging toward them, the black muzzle turning to point straight down their throats. For an instant, the 2 tanks faced each other head-on, gun to gun, at killing range. The Germans had the first shot, and at that distance, a first shot was very likely the last. In the turret, Smoyer found himself staring directly into the barrel of the Panther's gun. There was no time left to think. Then came a stroke of fortune. the Americans would only understand later. The Panther did not fire. Its commander, it seems, had never seen the new Pershing before, and in that frozen instant he may have hesitated, unsure whether the strange tank in front of him was friend or foe. That hesitation lasted only a heartbeat, but it was everything. Smoyer's driver, instead of stopping and presenting an easy target, gunned the engine and drove the Pershing forward into the open, and Clarence Smoyer, not waiting for the tank to halt, laid his sight on the Panther and squeezed the trigger. The 90mm gun roared. The first armor-piercing shell struck the Panther just beneath its gun shield, a clean, hard hit. Smoyer did not pause. His loader slammed another round into the breech, and he fired again, and then a third time, the shots crashing out as fast as the gun could be loaded. The rounds tore into the side of the German tank, punching clean through its armor. In his perch above the square, the cameraman flinched as each blast shook his camera, but he kept filming. In just a few seconds, the duel was decided. The Panther was finished. Flames burst from the stricken Panther as fire reached its fuel and ammunition. Several of the German crew were killed in those first terrible moments, while others managed to throw themselves out of the burning tank and stumble to safety. Black smoke boiled up into the sky over the square, and the Panther would go on burning into the next day. Above the wreck and the smoke, framed in the cameraman's lens, rose the undamaged spires of Cologne Cathedral, serene and immense, as if watching over the small, deadly human drama played out at its feet. Sergeant Jim Bates had done something almost no cameraman in the war ever managed. He had filmed a tank duel from start to finish, the approach, the face-off, the shots, and the kill, all in a few unforgettable seconds. Combat between tanks was usually too fast, too chaotic, and too deadly to capture on film. But Bates had been in exactly the right place, and his nerve had held. His footage of the Pershing destroying the Panther beneath the cathedral was unlike almost anything else recorded in the entire conflict, and it would soon be seen far beyond the ruins of Cologne. The film was rushed back and released in newsreels around the world, playing in cinemas, to audiences hungry for proof that the war was being won. And in one of those audiences was something Clarence Smoyer could never have imagined. Back home in Pennsylvania, his sister-in-law recognized him in the flickering newsreel images of the tank crew. She brought his parents to the theater so they could see for themselves that their son was alive. For Smoyer's mother and father, it was the first time they had ever set foot in a movie house, and there on the screen was their boy, alive and at war. For Clarence Smoyer and his crew, though, there was no time to savor any fame. The war was not over. Within days, the Spearhead division crossed the Rhine and drove on deeper into Germany, fighting town by town toward the heart of a collapsing enemy, all the way to the region around Dessau, where the war in Europe would finally end for them. Smoyer had survived where so many tank crews had not. He had become, in the eyes of the newsreels, the hero of Cologne. But he carried something out of that city that no medal or film could ever ease. For amid all the triumph captured on that famous film was the memory of the young woman in the street, Katharina Esser, killed in the crossfire near the square. Clarence Smoyer did not know whether one of his own shells had been the one that struck her, and that uncertainty settled deep into his heart. He had done his duty, and he had done it superbly, but war had also made him part of something terrible and innocent and irreversible. For decades afterward, that doubt and that sorrow would travel home with him and refuse to let him go. When the war ended, Clarence Smoyer went home to Pennsylvania and did what so many of his generation did. He put the war away, took an ordinary job, raised a family, and rarely spoke of what he had seen and done. The newsreels had called him the hero of Cologne, but he wore the title uneasily and seldom mentioned it. The famous film of his duel played on in documentaries over the years, but the gentle man at the center of it lived quietly, carrying his pride and his private grief side by side, telling almost no one about the minute that had defined his war. Then, late in his life, his story was finally told in full, and something remarkable happened. With the help of others, Smoyer was able to make contact with a survivor from the other side of that duel, a German veteran who had faced him in Cologne. The two old men, who had once tried to kill each other, met as friends. Together they returned to Cologne, to the very square where it had happened, and together they visited the grave of Katharina Esser and laid flowers there. Both men, it turned out, had carried the same guilt over her death for their entire lives. In the cathedral that had watched over it all, Smoyer lit a candle for the young woman and quietly asked her forgiveness. In 2019, nearly 75 years on, the army awarded him and his crew the Bronze Star for Cologne. He accepted it humbly, saying he would honor it in memory of all the young men who never came home. The film of that minute survives, and it still stops people cold, one savage instant of war. But the rest of the story shows something greater, that even men on opposite ends of those guns could, in the end, find peace. If your family served in the tanks or fought across Europe, share their name in the comments, and one thing about them. So many never came home. Remember them by name. Subscribe if you would like the next story.